We talk about men and masculinities in chapter 7 and kind of how
There's
men,
been great changes there.
how men are gendered beings, and some of those changes. And our own research looks at men and masculinities, and research on men and masculinities emerged in the 1970s and the 1980s, and really focused on both the damage men do, but also the damage done to men. That men gain great privilege from their gender, but they also suffer greatly.
It comes at a serious cost.
Yeah, absolutely. But this research emerged at a time that was an incredibly homophobic time in British and American history. It was the height of moralizing around and religious moralizing around same-sex sexuality. It was a time when HIV/AIDS was occurring and was kind of a big problem, and
Predominantly in the gay community at first, yes.
and was stigmatized by mainstream discourse, and so all of this led to a perfect storm of homophobia in society. And what was shown was that men adopted homophobic perspectives, not necessarily because of anti-gay animus in themselves, but as a way of proving their own masculinity. So as a way to be a guy, the way you showed your masculinity was to be not feminine and not gay.
Right.
And so lots of that research showed that men went to great lengths to avoid this. So whether it's how men sat, whether it was sat with legs wide open, then legs crossed, whether it was having a rucksack that was only over one shoulder rather than two shoulders, certainly not having a satchel, because again, that was feminized, men avoided things that were deemed feminine or gay in society.
Okay. So you're telling me that the social became personal, that there was such great stigma about homosexuality that men had to police their behaviors in order not to be thought gay.
Yeah, and men wouldn't connect this and wouldn't be recognizing this at the time, but there was just this complete, self-policing and policing of others in terms of how people acted and engaged and behaved. But what we found, and obviously your work in particular, and then also mine, has looked at how this has been changing over the past 30 years. Wide-scale, big quantitative surveys show us homophobia is decreasing, show us that in the West in particular, and certainly in America and the UK and Australia, attitudes are improving towards sexual minorities.
At a very rapid rate.
More than 1% a year for 40 years, kind of. It's gone from a majority homophobic opinion to now in the UK it's down to about 20% of people don't support gay rights, basically.
And assumingly that's an older generation too. Millennials wouldn't relate to homophobia, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we've been finding with our research on younger men, that they reject homophobic attitudes, that they have gay friends, and that they embody kind of this kind of much more pro-gay attitude. And what we've found is that these men will then exhibit much softer masculinities. And so that where in the 80s and 90s, men had to get into fights, had to be emotionally stoic, couldn't share emotions, and couldn't have any physical closeness with another man. The only physical closeness you could get with men in the 80s and 90s was through fighting. Now, modern day men are being much more tactile, much more emotionally intimate. For British and American kind of readers and viewers, I called it the One Direction effect, because One Direction at the time they won.
This is a popular rock group in Britain mostly.
Yeah, in Britain, but I think they made it to the States as well. But yeah, they modelled and mirrored that masculinity that was popular.
Softer
masculinity, very tactile and very emotionally open about their problems that they've continued to do. And even if some of them got tattoos, there were still tattoos of butterflies and things like that. So this behaviours, this softening of masculinity is something that really occurred. And then what was interesting in a study we did together, we looked at how some sportsmen, young sportsmen at a university, cuddled with each other, shared beds with each other, cuddled and spooned with each other. And so I think that article was studied in the book, so people can read up on it if they want. But what was particularly interesting was how people we spoke to about this reacted to that study. So the study was, look, men have gone from being not tactile to spooning in bed with each other.
Yes. It's quite a change, isn't it?
And it was quite a change, and it got media. So it was covered on a whole bunch of kind of websites, and it was covered on local radio, and I did lots of local radio on it in America, in Canada, and in the UK. And it was oftentimes the radio hosts who were covering it were men in their 40s and 50s or thereabouts. And they thought it was a nice thing. They weren't anti it. They thought it was great, and they were absolutely supportive of kind of the pro-gay move and kind of the lack of homophobia, they couldn't comprehend that young guys were cuddling and spooning in bed. It was just such anathema. They would talk about that they loved their best friends and they would die for their best friends, but there's no way they would spoon in bed.
Yes.
And so there was this shock, and they wanted, you know, a sociologist on their radio show to talk about it because it was so shocking to them. But
Yes.
then, when I did a lecture on it at my university at the time to like 100 students or so, they were shocked as well. But they were shocked, and their kind of surprise and what they couldn't understand is how we had written an article about it. Because for them, it was just
So
something they did in
normal.
their everyday
Yeah.
life. It was they had done that. They had spooned,
Yeah.
and if it was women, female students, they had spoken about how their male friends or their boyfriends did that
Yeah.
as well. For them, it was just their everyday experience. And so
Yeah.
to get back to the sociological imagination, what we actually see with cuddling is it's this window on an incredibly micro, intimate, personal behaviour. It's a window to this broad social change.
Yes.
Why have men gone from not cuddling and being kind of stigmatizing of that behavior in the 80s to it just being this ordinary everyday thing? And so by thinking sociologically about it, we see the change over time, and then we see the generational difference as well, that men who are 18, 19 just get it and think it's normal
Yep.
and think it's everyday, and men who are 40, 50, even if they like the idea, it's so shocking and different and new to them.
Now, there's also a transnational difference here, and that's one of the things that makes us such a very good team. Is I'm American, I have extensive ties and do extensive research in America, you're British, and we do research on this topic in both countries. Because a number of the students watching this video will think, well, hang on a minute, we're not cuddling here in the States. That is, to them, novel. And this shows what we would call a cultural lag. Now, there's a difference between what's been going on in Britain and that the Britain has been ahead of the United States for about a decade ahead. So, for example, when I found that about 89% of undergraduate males had kissed another male here in England, a year later, we went to the United States and we went to 11 universities, and we found that that percentage was only at 10%. But one thing that we know is it's coming. Whatever happens in Britain, it seems to be happening in America just a decade later.
And we see that because both the UK and the US are kind of Western countries, and in how we talk about modernity in Chapter 9, kind of they match those kind of core ideas.
Yes.
And so there is those differences and that lag. And then we see the other way it changes as well is you compare with some Middle Eastern countries and some African countries and China as well, where there's great tactility, but that it's always been that there's tactility and homophobia.
Yes.
And so we see just there's a completely different history where tactility has not been ever associated with being gay. Like
Yes.
being gay is seen as a Western idea, and people in those countries, you know, are extremely homophobic, and that can't even be seen to happen.
So they're free to hold hands in public because they can't be labeled gay.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, but then we see it, and so we see again how these cultural changes and how important society is. You can cuddle in the UK now, and that's fine because there isn't that homophobia. You couldn't cuddle in the 80s because that was seen as gay, but then in other countries and with kind of different histories, you can cuddle because no one would presume it was anything other than two straight men.
Cultural context is everything.
Indeed.
Yes. Discovering sociology, that's what it's about, isn't it?
Absolutely.